In a flawless wedding ceremony, perfection is shattered when a furious woman storms into the ballroom, revealing a dark secret. With a brutal assault, she endangers the life of the bride, who is pregnant. The chaos that ensues will leave an indelible mark on everyone present and change the course of the young woman's life, who must now fight for her future. If this story grabs you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's get into it. I promise this is going to be the best story you've ever heard. The Grand Ballroom of the Plaza Hotel in New York City had never seen such elaborate decoration. Arrangements of imported white orchids cascaded from the ceiling in delicate waterfalls, while vanilla-scented candles perfumed every corner of the room. The ivory, velvet upholstered chairs formed symmetrical rows, occupied by 300 guests dressed in their finest attire. The golden light from the crystal chandeliers reflected off the champagne flutes circulating among the attendees, creating an almost magical glow that transformed the space into something out of a fairy tale. Marina Hayes adjusted the French lace veil covering her brown hair, which was swept into an elegant bun for the 10th time. Her green eyes, a gift from her maternal grandmother, sparkled with a mix of nervousness and anticipation. Her right hand rested gently on her still discreet belly, where a 4-month-old life was growing, protected. The ivory silk gown with pearl embroidery had been custom designed for her by a renowned stylist, with a cut that disguised the pregnancy without completely hiding it. After all, that baby was part of the reason the wedding was happening in such a hurry. In the anteroom, her mother, Helen Hayes, checked every detail with the precision of a general commanding her troops. Helen was an elegant 52-year-old woman with impeccably styled blonde hair and a navy blue dress that cost more than an economy car. She came from a traditional New York family, owners of a development firm that erected commercial buildings throughout the state. Marina's marriage to Philip Sterling wasn't just a union of love, it was also a strategic alliance between two of New York City's most influential families. Across town, just 30 minutes away, a 30-year-old woman paced nervously in her small Upper East Side apartment. Vanessa Price wore a tight red dress that accentuated her curves with a plunging neckline and a thigh-high slit. Her black hair fell in waves over her bare shoulders. Her almond-shaped eyes, heavy with mascara and dark eyeshadow, held a dangerous glint, a mixture of determination and contained fury. She clutched her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. On the screen, a photo of Philip Sterling, smiling beside Marina, was shared by the Sterling family's public relations team. The caption announced the wedding of the year, uniting two business dynasties. Vanessa's stomach churned. That man had promised her a future. They had slept together just last night. He had whispered words of love while holding her in his arms, assuring her the wedding was just a formality, a family demand, but that his heart belonged to her. Vanessa threw the phone onto the sofa and walked to the mirror. She studied her reflection with eyes that burned with rage. She wasn't just some hidden mistress. She was the woman Philip turned to when he needed something real, something passionate, someone who understood him without making demands. Marina was just a convenient choice, a spoiled girl who got pregnant on purpose to trap him. At least that's what Philip had told her. The idea began to form in her mind like a gathering storm. If Philip didn't have the courage to own up to his feelings, she would. She would go to that wedding. She would show everyone who truly owned his heart. Marina would find out, in the worst way possible, that she was marrying a man who belonged to another. In the ballroom of the plaza, the ceremony was about to begin. The string quartet started the first piece on their set list, a soft rendition of Pachelbel's Canon in D major. The guests settled into their seats, whispering, admiring comments about the decor and the sheer scale of the event. In the front row, Robert Hayes, Marina's father, adjusted his tie with steady fingers. He was a tall, 58-year-old man with perfectly combed graying hair and a posture that commanded instant respect. His blue eyes observed everything with meticulous attention. Robert had built a real estate empire from the ground up. Coming from a blue-collar family in upstate New York, he'd worked as a bricklayer before getting his first loan to buy a plot of land. Today, he owned one of the largest development firms in the state, responsible for building shopping malls, luxury condos and corporate towers. But nothing in his professional life compared to the love he felt for his only daughter. Marina was his princess, his reason for living, and he would do anything to protect her. Beside Robert, Helen clutched a white silk handkerchief, already anticipating the tears to come. She had dreamed of this day since Marina was a little girl. Her daughter marrying a man from a respectable family, securing a stable future. Philip Sterling wasn't Robert's perfect choice. He had sensed something unstable in the young man from the start, but Helen had insisted it was the ideal match. Philip Sterling waited at the altar, beside the officiant and his groomsmen. He was a handsome 28-year-old with angular features, light brown hair slicked back, and a smile that usually disarmed any female resistance. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo, but his hands were trembling slightly. It wasn't the usual groom's nerves. It was fear, a visceral fear that something would go wrong, that Vanessa would follow through on her threats from the past few days. She had called that morning, saying she was tired of being hidden. Philip had tried to calm her with empty promises, assuring her that after the wedding they would find a way to be together without a scandal. But Vanessa was no longer willing to wait. Her voice, once sweet and seductive, sounded different now, laced with something dark he couldn't quite interpret. The music changed. It was time for the bride's entrance. The double doors of the ballroom opened slowly, revealing Marina on her father's arm. She held a bouquet of white roses and lilies, with satin ribbons trailing to the floor. Her dress glided elegantly over the red carpet as she walked. The guests rose to their feet, admiring the serene beauty of the woman who seemed to float toward the altar. Marina felt her legs tremble, but she maintained a delicate smile. Her eyes met Philip's, who forced a smile in return. Robert, walking beside his daughter, took measured steps as if wanting to prolong these last few moments when she was still entirely his. He felt something strange in the air, a tension he couldn't name. Years of business negotiations had taught him to read people, and Philip Sterling was an open book to him. The young man was hiding something when they reached the altar. Robert kissed Marina's forehead tenderly and gave her hand to Philip. For a brief moment his eyes met his future son-in-law's, and Robert saw fear in that gaze. Not love, not joy, but pure fear. He took a reluctant step back and took his place beside his wife. The officiant began the ceremony with solemn words about the sacrament of marriage, about the eternal commitment between two souls joining before God and man. Marina heard every word as if they were drops of honey, savoring the promise of a future with the man she loved. She didn't notice that. Philip could barely concentrate, that his eyes kept darting toward the ballroom doors. And then it happened. The double doors burst open with a resounding crash that echoed through the entire room, cutting off the officiant's words. The sound was so violent that some guests screamed in alarm. All eyes turned to the entrance. There stood Vanessa Price, poised like a vision from hell, wearing that red dress that contrasted brutally with the immaculate purity of the room. Her black hair billowed slightly in the draught, and her eyes were fixed on Philip with an intensity that could set the ballroom on fire. The silence that followed was deafening. 300 people held their breath at once. The officiant froze, unsure how to react. Marina turned slowly, still holding her bouquet, and saw the woman striding down the center aisle with determined steps. Her high heels clicked on the marble floor like war drums. Vanessa never took her eyes off Philip. Her voice tore through the silence like a sharp blade as she screamed that this man belonged to her, that he had spent the previous night in her arms, that he had promised her eternal love while lying beside her. The words fell upon the guests like bombs, blowing apart the perfect facade of the ceremony. Marina felt her legs give way. Her eyes filled with tears instantly. She looked at Philip, searching for a denial, for him to say this was a lie, that this woman was crazy. But Philip remained motionless, ashen-faced, unable to utter a single word. The guilt on his face was confession enough. Vanessa reached the altar and violently snatched the bouquet from Marina's hands. The flowers flew through the air, white petals scattering across the floor like snow in a blizzard. Marina tried to hold on, but Vanessa was stronger, fueled by a consuming rage. When the bouquet finally came loose, Vanessa hurled it against the marble floor, and the sound of the stems snapping echoed through the hall. Before anyone could react, Vanessa raised her hand and slapped Marina across the face with enough force to make her head whip to the side. The crack of palm against skin was sharp, cutting, undeniable. Marina staggered, losing her balance from the impact. Her knees buckled and she fell, the silk dress pooling around her like a cloud. Instinctively, her hands flew to her belly, her eyes wide with pure terror for her baby, for the possibility of losing the child growing inside her. The shock of the fall reverberated through the soul of everyone present. Women screamed. Men shot up from their chairs. Cell phones were instantly raised, capturing every second of the surreal scene. Helen brought her hands to her mouth, choking on her own breath. Robert remained seated, but his fingers gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. Philip, at the altar, seemed to have turned to stone. His eyes were fixed on Marina, crumpled on the floor, protecting her womb with her hands. But he didn't move, he didn't shout, he didn't run to help her. He just stood there, paralyzed, while the woman carrying his child lay on the floor, terrified and hurt. Vanessa lunged forward again, ready to strike Marina once more. Her hand rose in the air, fingers clawed, eyes blind with rage. It was then that two security guards finally reacted, sprinting down the aisle and grabbing Vanessa by the arms before she could complete the motion. She struggled, screaming, cursing, calling Marina a gold digger, an opportunist, a woman who used a pregnancy to trap a man who never loved her. On the floor, Marina trembled. Tears streamed down her face, smudging her carefully applied makeup. She murmured softly, words of protection for her baby, praying to God that the child was okay, that the fall hadn't hurt her baby. Her hands caressed her belly in circular motions, as if she could soothe the child through her touch. The guests' murmurs grew into shouts. Some women were crying. Others were filming compulsively. Men were making calls, asking for ambulances, lawyers, the police. The perfect ceremony had devolved into absolute chaos. The music had stopped. The officiant had backed away until he hit the altar, not knowing what to do. The world seemed to have crumbled in a matter of seconds. But what was most shocking, what hurt the hearts of those present the most, was the immobility of Philip Sterling. He remained there at the altar, watching Marina on the floor without doing a single thing. His passivity was more glaring than any violence. It was a silent confession to everything Vanessa had said. He didn't love Marina, he never had. And in this moment of truth, when she needed him, most when she was carrying his child and had been publicly attacked, he chose to do nothing. It was then that the ballroom doors opened for a third time. No one had noticed, but Robert Hayes was no longer sitting beside his wife. He had slipped out discreetly when security detained Vanessa, walking to the back of the hall. Now he returned, and his presence was impossible to ignore. Robert Hayes was not an overly tall or particularly muscular man, but he carried an authority that made everyone around him instinctively defer. His steps were slow, measured, firm. His Italian leather shoes clicked on the floor with a rhythm that cut through the chaos. His face remained neutral, but his blue eyes shone with something that made the blood run cold in the veins of anyone who met his gaze. He walked down the center aisle without rushing, completely ignoring the guests who scrambled out of his way. Vanessa, still held by security, felt a shiver run down her spine when she saw him. There was something about that man that awakened a primal fear. Robert reached the spot where Marina had fallen and knelt beside her carefully, as if any sudden movement might break her further. His large, calloused hand touched his daughter's face with a tenderness that contrasted violently with the coldness in his eyes. He wiped away Marina's tears with his thumb, noting the red mark on her cheek where the slap had landed. His voice, when it finally came, was low, but it carried a weight that made everyone in the ballroom fall silent instantly to hear it. "Who did this to you?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement that demanded an answer. Marina opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She was in too much shock to speak. It was one of the bridesmaids, Julia, Marina's best friend since childhood, who stepped forward and pointed at Vanessa, explaining what had happened in a trembling voice. Robert rose slowly, his eyes finding Vanessa for the first time. She tried to maintain a defiant posture, but something in the man's expression made her involuntarily shrink back. Robert walked toward her with the same controlled calm, stopping just inches away. He looked her up and down as if assessing something worthless. His voice remained low as he declared that his daughter had been assaulted while pregnant, and that Vanessa would remain in the custody of his security until the authorities arrived. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply stated what would happen, and no one in the ballroom doubted it would be exactly so. Vanessa tried to protest, to claim she had a right to be there, but Robert silenced her with a single look. Next, he turned to the altar. His eyes met Philip Sterling's, who immediately took a step back, nearly tripping over his own feet. Philip opened his mouth to speak, but Robert raised a hand demanding silence. The gesture was so authoritative that Philip obeyed instantly, shutting his mouth like a scolded child. Robert walked to the altar with steps that resonated like thunder. He stopped just a few feet from Philip, observing the young man with eyes that seemed to see straight through his soul. Philip tried to stammer an explanation, saying he had frozen in fear, that he didn't know how to react, that he was in shock. The words tumbled out, desperate, pathetic. Robert let Philip finish. He waited patiently for all the empty excuses to run out. When silence finally fell between them, Robert uttered a single sentence in a tone so low that only Philip and those closest could hear it clearly. She was on the floor, and you did nothing. The words fell on Philip like a death sentence. There was no way to refute them. There was no possible explanation. It was the raw, undeniable truth. Marina had been attacked, she was pregnant, she had fallen, and Philip had remained motionless at the altar, not lifting a finger to protect her. Philip tried to speak again, begged for forgiveness, claimed he still loved Marina, that his thing with Vanessa meant nothing, that he was confused, that he'd made a mistake. But Robert cut him off with a firm gesture of his hand. He declared in a voice that brooked no argument that Philip would no longer have access to Marina or the baby she carried. The engagement was dissolved. The ceremony was over. There would be no wedding. Shame enveloped Philip like a heavy cloak. He looked around, seeing the faces of the guests, most of them now recording or taking pictures. He saw the contempt in the eyes of people who, minutes ago, had greeted him with cordial smiles. He saw the disappointment on the faces of his own parents, sitting in the front row on the other side, unable to defend him because there was no possible defense. Robert returned to Marina, helping her to her feet with care. She was pale, still trembling, but she leaned on her father and allowed him to lead her out of the ballroom. Helen followed immediately, grabbing her purse and phone. Their exit was silent, dignified, despite the chaos. Robert kept a firm arm around his daughter's shoulders, shielding her from the curious stares. Outside, an ambulance was already waiting, called by one of the quicker-thinking guests. The paramedics helped Marina lie down on the stretcher carefully, checking her vital signs immediately. Helen got into the ambulance with her daughter, holding her hand as tears finally rolled freely down her face. Robert stayed outside just long enough to give instructions to the security guards about Vanessa, ensuring she wouldn't be released until the police arrived. Inside the ballroom, the chaos continued. Guests gathered in small circles, commenting, speculating, judging. The cell phones remained raised, capturing every possible angle. The videos were already starting to circulate on social media before the ambulance had even left the parking lot. Philip remained at the altar alone, abandoned even by his own groomsmen. The shame consumed him from within. Vanessa, still held by security, finally began to grasp the magnitude of what she had done. The adrenaline of her rage was fading, replaced by something cold and heavy settling in her chest. She looked around, seeing the looks of disgust, the cameras pointed at her. Her life, just like the ceremony, had completely fallen apart. The ambulance siren cut through the New York night as the vehicle headed toward New York Presbyterian Hospital, one of the most renowned in the city. Marina lay on the stretcher, her eyes closed, her hands still protecting her belly. Helen held her daughter's other hand, whispering words of comfort that seemed insufficient in the face of such trauma. Inside the ambulance, one of the paramedics checked Marina's blood pressure, concerned by the high numbers. The emotional shock, combined with the fall and the pregnancy, created a delicate situation that required immediate attention. He explained to Helen that they would run all the necessary tests to ensure the baby was okay, that Marina was in good hands. Robert followed close behind in his car, driving with a clenched jaw and eyes fixed on the road. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Rage simmered inside him, but it was a controlled, cold, calculated rage. He was already mentally planning the next steps. Vanessa Price would be prosecuted. Philip Sterling would never get near his daughter again, and anyone who dared to question Marina's dignity would have to answer to him personally. The car cut through the late-night traffic of Manhattan, passing by the illuminated storefronts where tourists and locals enjoyed the evening, oblivious to the drama unfolding just a few blocks away. Robert thought about how quickly life could change. Hours ago, he was adjusting his tie to walk his daughter down the aisle. Now he was chasing an ambulance, fearing for her well-being and that of the grandchild who hadn't even been born yet. At New York Presbyterian, the medical team was ready to receive Marina. An on-call obstetrician, Dr. Carla Reed, was waiting at the emergency entrance with a full team. As soon as the ambulance arrived, Marina was quickly transferred to a hospital gurney and taken to an examination room. Helen accompanied her, refusing to let go of her daughter's hand for a second. Dr. Reed, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a calm voice, examined Marina carefully. She asked about the fall, about where Marina felt pain, about any bleeding. Marina answered in a weak voice, still in a state of shock. The doctor ordered a series of tests, including an ultrasound to check on the baby, as well as X-rays to rule out any fractures. Robert arrived minutes later, practically running through the hospital corridors until he found Helen in the waiting room. She threw herself into his arms, finally allowing her despair to take over. Robert held her tightly, but his eyes remained dry, vigilant. He couldn't afford to break down now. Marina needed him to be strong. Dr. Reed came out of the exam room after what felt like hours, but was only 40 minutes. Her face was serious as she approached the Hazes. She explained that Marina had suffered significant physical and emotional trauma, but the initial tests showed that the baby was stable. The fetal heartbeat was strong and regular. However, there was a risk of future complications due to the shock and the fall. Marina would need complete bed, rest for the next few weeks, and constant medical supervision. Helen cried with relief upon hearing the baby was okay. Robert, for his part, asked more practical questions about the necessary care, what signs to watch for, when Marina might be discharged. The doctor explained that they preferred to keep Marina in the hospital for at least 48 hours for observation to ensure there were no delayed complications. Robert agreed immediately. Money was no object. Marina would have the best room in the hospital, the best team, whatever was necessary. He gave clear instructions to the administration about who could and could not visit his daughter. Philip Sterling's name was at the top of the prohibited list. Robert was adamant on this point. That man had lost any right to Marina. Meanwhile, back at the plaza, the police had finally arrived. 2 NYPD officers were interviewing witnesses and taking statements. Vanessa Price was formally arrested on assault charges. She tried to argue, to claim she was defending her relationship, but the videos recorded by dozens of guests left no room for interpretation. She had publicly assaulted a pregnant woman. Philip was still in the ballroom, sitting in one of the front row chairs, his head in his hands. His parents had left, too ashamed to stay. The few friends who remained tried to console him, but there was no consolation possible. He had destroyed everything. He had lost Marina, lost his child, lost his reputation. And the worst part was knowing he deserved every ounce of that suffering. On social media, the videos of the assault already had millions of views. People commented furiously, condemning Philip for his inaction. He had become a symbol of cowardice, of betrayal, of everything a man shouldn't be. Bloggers were writing articles with sensational headlines. Gossip sites shared every detail. His name was ruined. At the hospital, Marina finally managed to sleep after doctors authorized a mild sedative. She rested in a comfortable bed in a private room, monitored by equipment that registered every beat of the baby's heart. The rhythmic, steady sound was a comfort to Helen, who refused to leave her daughter's side. Robert occupied an armchair by the window, watching the city lights through the glass. He wouldn't sleep. He wouldn't eat. He would do nothing but keep watch until he was absolutely certain Marina was safe. His thoughts were a mix of anger, sadness, and a paternal love so intense it was a physical ache in his chest. He thought of all the times Marina had come home talking about Philip, her eyes shining with passion. Robert had never fully trusted the young man, but he had kept quiet so as not to hurt his daughter. Now he bitterly regretted it. He should have spoken up. He should have investigated more thoroughly. He should have protected Marina from this terrible pain. But it was too late for regrets now. What mattered was the future. Marina would recover, the baby would be born healthy, and Robert would ensure that nothing and no one ever hurt his daughter again, even if it meant pushing away anyone he considered a threat, even if it meant rebuilding Marina's life from scratch. As the city slept outside, Robert Hayes made a silent vow. He would protect Marina and his grandchild with everything he had, and anyone who dared to threaten them would discover that there were terrible consequences for crossing Robert Hayes. The wedding night had ended in tragedy, but this was just the beginning of a new story. A story of resilience, of strength, and of an unshakable father's love. Dawn broke over New York City, bringing a golden light that streamed into the hospital room through the half-drawn curtains. Marina woke slowly, still feeling the residual effects of the sedative. For a few blessed seconds she remembered nothing. Then, like a crushing wave, the memory returned, the wedding dress, the altar, Vanessa appearing like a red nightmare, the slap, the fall, Philip's inaction. Her hands flew instinctively to her belly, and she felt a momentary wave of relief as she realized she was in a hospital bed, connected to monitors that emitted rhythmic, reassuring beeps. The sound of the baby's heartbeat echoed through the room, confirming that the life inside her was still pulsing strongly. Helen was asleep in an armchair beside the bed, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, still wearing the now wrinkled navy blue dress from the day before. Robert had left a few hours earlier to handle urgent matters, but had promised to be back soon. Marina watched her mother sleep and felt a surge of tenderness mixed with guilt. Helen had dreamed of this wedding for so long, planned every detail with love and dedication, and Marina felt as if she had destroyed it all. But then anger began to replace the guilt. She hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't invited Vanessa to crash the ballroom. She hadn't chosen to be betrayed by Philip. She hadn't decided to be attacked while carrying a child. Marina took a deep breath, trying to control the emotions that threatened to overflow again. The room door opened softly, and Dr. Carla Reed entered, accompanied by a nurse. She smiled when she saw Marina was awake and approached the bed with quiet steps so as not to wake Helen. She checked the monitors, made a few notes on her clipboard, and then sat on the edge of the bed. "How are you feeling, Marina?" The doctor's voice was gentle but professional. Marina considered the question. How was she feeling? Betrayed, humiliated, furious, scared, but above all, determined to protect her baby from all this chaos. She replied that she was better, that the pain was gone, but that she felt a strange emptiness in her chest, as if something had been ripped out of her. Dr. Reed nodded with understanding. She explained that Marina's body had suffered a physical trauma, but her mind also needed time to process everything. She recommended psychological counseling and assured her that the hospital offered full support. As for the baby, the morning's tests confirmed that everything was stable, but Marina would need to strictly follow the recommendations for bed rest. Helen woke to the sound of their voices and immediately got up, approaching her daughter with eyes swollen from crying. She held Marina's hand and whispered apologies, as if she were somehow to blame for it all. Marina squeezed her mother's hand back, trying to convey that there was nothing to apologize for. After the doctor left, the two women sat in silence for a few minutes. It was Helen who finally broke it, saying they needed to talk about what would happen now. The wedding was cancelled, that was certain, but there were practical matters to resolve. The baby, Philip's paternal rights, the legal situation with Vanessa, the social fallout from it all. Marina listened as her mother listed each problem, feeling anxiety build in her chest. She didn't want to think about Philip right now. She didn't want to imagine Vanessa. She just wanted to stay there in the protective bubble of the hospital with the sound of her baby's heartbeat reminding her that there was something pure and good amidst all the destruction. But Helen insisted. They needed to make decisions while Robert wasn't there, because he would make all the decisions for them if he could. And as much as his fatherly love was unconditional, Marina needed to have an active voice in her own future. Helen surprised her daughter with those words. She had expected her mother to simply agree with whatever Robert decided. Marina asked what Helen thought should be done. Her mother sighed deeply before answering. She said that Philip had shown his true colors, a weak man, incapable of taking responsibility or protecting those he claimed to love. But he was still the baby's biological father, and that would bring legal complications. As for Vanessa, Helen believed she should be held accountable for her actions, but that lawsuits also brought additional public exposure. "What do you want, Marina?" Helen asked directly. "Not what your father wants, not what society expects. What do you want for yourself and for your child?" Marina closed her eyes, thinking. What she wanted was to go back in time and never have met Philip Sterling. She wanted to have listened to the subtle warnings her father always gave. She wanted to have trusted her own instincts that told her something was off in Philip's behavior in recent months. But she couldn't go back in time. She could only move forward. She opened her eyes and told her mother that she wanted to raise her child far away from Philip. She didn't want that man to have any part in the child's life. He didn't deserve it. And as for Vanessa, Marina wanted her to pay for what she did, but not through the exposure of a public trial. There was already enough suffering being broadcast on social media. Helen nodded slowly. These were difficult decisions, and they would have to talk to Robert, but she would support Marina in whatever path she chose. Mother and daughter hugged, and for the first time since the disaster of the previous day, Marina felt a small spark of hope ignite within her. Robert returned to the hospital around 10 in the morning, bringing clean clothes for Marina and Helen, along with a bag of homemade food prepared by the family's cook. He also brought news from the outside world, and none of it was particularly good. The videos of the assault had gone viral overnight. Millions of people had watched, commented, judged. The Hayes family name was on every news portal, gossip blog, and morning talk show. Some outlets treated Marina with sympathy, portraying her as the victim of a terrible situation. Others speculated about why Philip had cheated, insinuating that perhaps Marina wasn't woman enough to hold him. Robert was visibly furious about the speculation. He had already instructed the family's lawyers to send notices to the most offensive outlets, threatening defamation lawsuits. Marina asked him not to, saying it would only draw more attention to the case. She preferred to let the dust settle naturally. Robert didn't agree, but he respected his daughter's wishes. Instead, he focused on more practical matters. Vanessa Price was in police custody and would be prosecuted. Philip Sterling was being pressured by his own family to make a public statement, but so far he remained silent, hidden away somewhere. The cancelled ceremony had resulted in significant financial losses, but Robert didn't care about the money. He only cared about Marina's recovery. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Julia, Marina's best friend, since their teenage years. Julia was a tall, slender woman of 26, with curly hair pulled back in a ponytail and expressive eyes that were now red from crying. She brought fresh flowers and a box of chocolates, but went straight to hug her friend on the bed, apologizing over and over for not stopping Vanessa from reaching Marina. Marina assured her there was nothing Julia could have done. It all happened too fast. Julia then sat on the bed and began to recount what had happened after Marina left in the ambulance. The chaos that ensued, the guests leaving, in groups gossiping, Philip's parents taking their son away, social media exploding. Julia had spent the night answering messages, defending her friend, blocking malicious people. She also mentioned that she had received several calls from Philip during the night. He was begging to speak to Marina, claiming he could explain everything, that he loved Marina and wanted a chance to redeem himself. Julia had blocked his number after the 10th call. She asked Marina if she wanted to hear what Philip had to say. Marina answered firmly that she did not, There was no possible explanation that could justify his behavior. Philip had betrayed her trust, lied repeatedly, and maintained a parallel relationship while they were planning a future together. And when the crucial moment came, when she was attacked and needed protection, he just stood there. That told Marina everything she needed to know about who Philip really was. Robert listened to his daughter speak with a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride because she was showing strength in a devastating moment. Sadness because no father should have to see his daughter go through so much pain. He placed a hand on Marina's shoulder and said he would support whatever decision she made. The following days in the hospital passed in a routine of tests, controlled visits, and a lot of rest. Marina received flowers and messages of support from close friends and family, but she refused any visitors other than her immediate family and Julia. She wasn't ready to face the outside world, to deal with looks of pity or morbid curiosity. Dr. Reed visited Marina 3 times a day, monitoring both her physical and emotional health. She suggested that Marina start talking to a psychologist specializing in trauma, and Marina reluctantly agreed. The first session took place in the hospital room itself, an initial conversation where the psychologist simply listened as Marina vented about everything that had happened. It was liberating to talk to someone who had no emotional connection to the situation, someone who wouldn't judge her or try to tell her what was best. The psychologist validated Marina's feelings, explaining that anger, sadness, confusion, and even relief were normal reactions to the trauma she had suffered. The important thing was to process each emotion in her own time without rush or external pressure. On the 3rd day of her hospital stay, Robert brought news. He had tried to avoid sharing, but that Marina deserved to know. Philip had given an interview to a popular television show, trying to explain his side of the story. The interview was set to air that night, and Robert wanted to know if Marina wished to watch it, or if she preferred that he and Helen summarize the content afterward. Marina thought for a long moment. Part of her didn't want to give Philip the satisfaction of her attention. Another part felt she needed to hear what he had to say, even if it was just lies or pathetic excuses. In the end, she decided to watch. She needed that dose of reality to definitively close that chapter of her life. That evening, Robert turned on the television in the room to the correct channel. Helen held Marina's hand as the show's intro began. The host, a middle-aged man known for controversial interviews, introduced Philip with a mix of sensationalism and false empathy. Philip appeared on screen wearing a simple white shirt, no tie, with his hair intentionally disheveled to look vulnerable. His eyes were swollen, as if he had been crying recently. Marina's stomach churned at the sight of him, but she forced herself to keep watching. The host started with direct questions. Why had Philip cheated on Marina? Why did he maintain a relationship with Vanessa Price while he was engaged? Why didn't he react when Marina was attacked? Philip answered in a hesitant voice, pausing dramatically between sentences as if he were struggling with his emotions. He claimed that he had known Vanessa years before Marina, that they had a complicated history that was never fully resolved. When he started dating Marina, he tried to break up with Vanessa, but she refused to accept the end of the relationship. She kept seeking him out, showing up at places where he would be, creating situations where they would meet accidentally. Philip admitted he was weak, that he had given in to Vanessa's advances a few times because she made him feel important, desired in a way he didn't feel with Marina. He said Marina was too perfect, that the pressure of being with someone so far above him was suffocating. With Vanessa, he could be imperfect, flawed, human. Marina squeezed her mother's hand tightly, feeling rage boil inside her. Philip was trying to blame her for being too perfect, as if being a good person was a flaw that justified betrayal. The host then asked about Philip's reaction during the assault, or rather, his lack of reaction. Why didn't he defend Marina when Vanessa attacked her? Philip lowered his head, and his hands trembled visibly. He said he went into shock, that his brain simply shut down in the face of such a surreal scene. He claimed he never imagined Vanessa was capable of physical violence, that he was still processing her presence in the ballroom when everything happened too quickly. Robert let out a sound of contempt. Even in a planned interview, with time to craft excuses, Philip couldn't be convincing. His justifications sounded empty, selfish, pathetic. The host pressed on. What about the baby? Did Philip still want to be a part of the child's life? This question made Philip lift his head and look directly at the camera, as if speaking directly to Marina. He said yes. He wanted to be a father, that even though he had failed as a partner, he would not fail as a father. He asked Marina to at least give him that chance. Marina turned off the television before the interview ended. She couldn't watch anymore. Seeing Philip try to redeem himself publicly, using fatherhood as a last-ditch effort to regain some relevance in her life, was unbearable. Helen hugged her daughter as she finally allowed the tears to fall freely. Robert left the room without a word. Helen knew her husband was furious, probably planning some kind of response to Philip's interview. She let him go. At that moment, her priority was to comfort her daughter. Marina cried for a long time, releasing all the pain she had held in since the day of the failed wedding. She cried for the betrayal, for the public humiliation, for the violence she suffered, for her lost innocence, for the family she had dreamed of building that would now never exist. She cried until there were no more tears, until her body was exhausted from so much emotion. When she finally calmed down, she said something to her mother that surprised Helen. She said she didn't want to prevent Philip from knowing his child. Not for his sake, but for the child's. Every child deserved the opportunity to know their father, even if that father was flawed and weak. But Philip would have to prove that he had changed, that he had grown, that he had learned from his mistakes, and that would take time, a lot of time. Helen agreed it was a mature and generous decision, especially given the circumstances. She asked if Marina was sure if she wasn't being too kind. Marina replied that she wasn't doing it out of kindness. She was doing it because she didn't want her child to grow up with the absence of a father weighing on them like it had on so many other children. If Philip chose not to be present or proved himself unworthy, the responsibility would be his alone. Robert returned to the room a few hours later, calmer. He had spoken with the lawyers and decided they would not respond to Philip's interview publicly. Any response would only prolong the media exposure. Instead, they would focus on resolving the legal issues discreetly. As for Philip's paternal rights, Robert said he would respect Marina's decision, but they would establish strict conditions for any contact with the child. The following days were of slow but steady recovery. Marina was discharged from the hospital with an extensive list of medical recommendations and a promise to return for weekly checkups. Robert hired private nurses to assist his daughter at home, as well as increasing security at their residence. He didn't trust that Vanessa wouldn't try something again, even if she was facing criminal charges. The Hayes mansion was in a gated community in Westchester, with a view of the Hudson River and 24-hour security. It was a spacious house, with well-tended gardens and an atmosphere of peace that contrasted completely with the chaos of the past few days. Marina settled into her old room, which Helen had kept exactly as it was before she moved in with Philip. Seeing that room brought a wave of nostalgia to Marina. The pastel-colored walls, the bookshelf filled with books she loved as a teenager, the picture frames with photos of happier family times. It was like returning to a simpler version of herself before she met Philip, before the pregnancy, before everything fell apart. Julia visited Marina daily, bringing news from the outside world that Marina wasn't ready to face personally. The videos of the assault were still circulating, but public attention was gradually waning as other scandals emerged. Vanessa remained in custody, awaiting trial. Philip had disappeared from public life after the disastrous interview. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after her discharge, Marina was sitting in the garden, reading a book on motherhood that Julia had brought her. The distant sound of boats on the river and the chirping of birds created a relaxing soundtrack. She absent-mindedly caressed her belly, mentally talking to the baby growing inside her. That's when her cell phone rang. An unknown number. Marina hesitated before answering, but something made her accept the call. The voice on the other end was female, mature, and filled with restrained emotion. It was Beatrice Sterling, Philip's mother. Marina almost hung up immediately, but Beatrice spoke quickly. begging for just a few minutes of conversation. She said she wasn't calling to defend her son, but to apologize personally for the suffering he had caused. As a mother, Beatrice felt responsible for not having raised Philip better, for not having taught him values that would have prevented him from acting so cowardly. Marina listened in silence as Beatrice spoke. The older woman said she would understand if Marina wanted no further contact with the Sterling family, but that she would love to be able to meet her grandchild when they were born. Not as a grandmother with rights, but as someone who would love that child unconditionally and could offer support if Marina allowed it. The sincerity in Beatrice's voice touched Marina in an unexpected way. She realized that Beatrice was not like Philip. She was a woman of character who was genuinely ashamed of her son. Marina responded kindly but firmly that she needed time. She wasn't ready to make decisions about who would be part of the baby's life, but she promised to consider Beatrice's request when she felt stronger. Beatrice thanked her emotionally and hung up. Marina stared at her phone for a long time, thinking about how complicated life was. Beatrice was not to blame for her son's actions, just as the baby Marina was carrying would not be to blame for its father's mistakes. It was unfair to punish innocent people for the crimes of others. That night, during family dinner, Marina shared the call from Beatrice with her parents. Robert was visibly uncomfortable with the idea of any contact with the Sterling family, but Helen surprisingly argued that Marina should keep an open mind. The baby deserved to have paternal grandparents if they were decent people, and Beatrice had always seemed like a kind-hearted woman. The discussion continued civilly, with each presenting valid arguments. In the end, they agreed that Marina would make the final decision when she felt ready, and that both Robert and Helen would respect that decision, even if they disagreed. After dinner, Marina went up to her room and stood on the balcony, watching the city lights in the distance. The cool night air carried the scent of the river, and she took a deep breath, feeling for the first time in weeks that maybe she could get through this. It wouldn't be easy. There would be bad days, there would be moments of intense pain, but she would survive. She placed a hand on her belly and whispered a promise to her baby. She promised she would be the best mother possible, that she would protect this child from any harm, that she would build a life full of love and security. She promised that her child would never feel the consequences of their parents' mistakes. And she promised herself that she would become stronger, not in spite of what happened, but because of it. Marina Hayes was beginning to rebuild her life from the rubble, and this time she would build it on a more solid foundation, based on her own strength and not on dependence on a man who never deserved her love. The future was still uncertain and frightening, but for the first time since the disaster at the altar, Marina felt a spark of hope ignite within her. And that hope was all she needed to take the next step. 3 months had passed since the day of the failed wedding. The New York summer was giving way to a mild autumn with cooler temperatures and a sky that alternated between deep blue and scattered clouds. Marina was in her 28th week of pregnancy, and her belly was now impossible to hide. She had adapted to a new routine, focused on taking care of herself and the baby, while slowly rebuilding her identity. The Hayes' home had become a safe sanctuary for Marina. She rarely left, except for medical appointments or short walks in the community's garden. Robert had hired a personal trainer specializing in prenatal fitness, who came 3 times a week to guide Marina through light exercises. Elliot helped her maintain her physical and mental health. Helen, meanwhile, had devoted herself completely to preparing for the baby, transforming one of the mansion's rooms into a nursery worthy of a magazine spread. Marina spent much of her days reading, books on motherhood, novels that transported her to different worlds, biographies of strong women who overcame adversity. Reading had become her escape, her refuge from the intrusive thoughts that still visited her in the early hours of the morning, reminding her of Vanessa's slap, Philip's inaction, the public humiliation. Her sessions with the psychologist continued twice a week. Dr. Renata Cole was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and eyes that conveyed genuine compassion. She had helped Marina process the trauma in a healthy way, to understand that feeling angry didn't make her a bad person, that crying wasn't a sign of weakness, and that rebuilding would take time, which was perfectly normal. One of the most important revelations Marina had during therapy was realizing that her relationship with Philip had always had red flags that she chose to ignore. The times he cancelled plans at the last minute without convincing explanations. The moments he seemed distant, even when he was physically present. The occasions when she felt deep down that something was wrong, but forced herself to believe his excuses. Marina realized she had become a smaller version of herself to fit the mold Philip expected. She had set aside her professional ambitions to be the perfect fiancée, the devoted future wife. Before meeting him, she worked at her father's development firm, learning the business with enthusiasm and showing real talent for project management. But Philip had subtly suggested that pregnant women shouldn't stress themselves with work, that she should focus on being a mother. Now, with the clarity that only comes with distance, Marina saw how she had been gently manipulated into becoming dependent. Philip wanted a trophy wife, not a true partner, and she, blinded by love and excited about the pregnancy, had accepted that role without question. But those days were over. Marina was rediscovering who she was without Philip, and she was liking this version of herself much more. One rainy April afternoon, Marina was in the house library, flipping through old photo albums, when Helen entered with a worried expression. She held a brown envelope in her hands, and Marina knew. Immediately it was news related to the legal proceedings. Helen sat beside her daughter and explained that the lawyers had received a petition from Philip formally requesting visitation rights after the baby's birth. The document was well drafted, with arguments about the importance of a paternal presence and references to legal precedents. Philip's lawyers claimed he had shown genuine remorse and was seeking therapy to deal with his character flaws. Marina read the document carefully, feeling a mix of conflicting emotions. Part of her still felt angry and wanted to completely deny Philip any access to the baby. Another part, the one that had matured in recent months, understood that the child deserved the opportunity to know their father, regardless of his mistakes as a partner. Helen watched her daughter process the information, ready to support her in any decision. Marina finally put the document aside and said she wanted to respond, but with very clear conditions. Philip could have supervised visitation after the birth, but only if he met specific requirements: consistent therapy with monthly proof, regular drug tests, no contact with Vanessa Price, and above all, any sign that he wasn't taking fatherhood seriously would result in an immediate suspension of visits. Helen was surprised by the maturity of the response. She had expected Marina to simply deny everything in anger, but her daughter had grown significantly in those 3 months. She was no longer the naive young woman who walked down the aisle. She was a strong woman, preparing to be a mother, making difficult decisions with clarity and purpose. Robert, when informed of Marina's decision, expressed valid concerns. He didn't trust Philip and feared the young man would hurt Marina again, this time using their child as a tool. But Marina assured her father that she was prepared to set firm boundaries. Philip would have no power over her ever again. He would be just the child's biological father, nothing more. The lawyers drafted a detailed response to Philip's petition, laying out all the conditions Marina had determined. The ball was now in his court. If he truly wanted to be a father, he would have to prove it through consistent actions, not just pretty words. While waiting for Philip's response, Marina began to think seriously about her professional future. The pregnancy wouldn't last forever, and she didn't want to be just the heiress to the family fortune, living without a purpose beyond motherhood. She would love being a mother, of that she had no doubt, but she also needed her own identity, accomplishments that were exclusively hers. Robert had always wanted Marina to take on a leadership role in the family's development firm. She had studied business administration at NYU with a focus on project management and showed a natural aptitude for the industry. Before Philip, she worked in the strategic planning department, helping to analyze the feasibility of new ventures. One morning, Marina sought out her father in his home office, where Robert worked remotely, a few days a week. She told him she wanted to return to work at the firm after her maternity leave, not in a symbolic position, but in a real role where she could contribute and grow professionally. Robert was visibly moved by the request. He had feared that the traumatic experience would make Marina shut herself off from the world, becoming reclusive and dependent. But here was his daughter, demonstrating strength and ambition, wanting to build something of her own. He assured her that a position would be waiting for her, with real responsibilities and opportunities for learning. Father and daughter spent the next few hours talking about the company's future projects, discussing ideas Marina had developed during her months at home. She had studied sustainability trends in construction and believed that Hayes' development could stand out by investing in green technologies. Robert listened attentively, impressed by the level of research she had done. That conversation marked a turning point for Marina. She realized there was life beyond the trauma, beyond the pregnancy, beyond being Philip Sterling's ex-fiancée. There was a strong, capable woman who was just beginning to discover her true potential. Julia remained a constant presence in Marina's life. The two friends spent entire afternoons talking about everything and nothing, from trivial gossip to deep discussions about the meaning of life. It was during one of these conversations that Julia revealed something she had been holding on to for weeks, waiting for the right moment. She had run into Vanessa Price by chance at a coffee shop in Soho. Vanessa was visibly changed, thinner, with deep, dark circles under her eyes and a generally worn-out appearance. Julia almost didn't recognize her. Vanessa saw Julia and, to her surprise, approached her, asking to talk. Marina tensed at the mention of Vanessa's name. She had tried not to think about the woman who had assaulted her, focusing her energy on positive things, but curiosity was stronger than aversion. She asked Julia to tell her what Vanessa had said. Vanessa had told Julia that she was facing criminal charges for the assault and would likely receive a probationary sentence. She had lost her job, most of her friends, and the respect of her own family. But what tormented her most was the awareness of what she had done. Vanessa said she woke up every night with nightmares about that day, seeing Marina fall to the floor over and over again. Julia asked why Vanessa did it, why she let jealousy drive her to commit violence against a pregnant woman. Vanessa replied that she was blind with rage and pain. Philip had promised her a future together for years, always saying he would leave his family to be with her. When he announced his wedding to Marina, Vanessa felt as if her world had collapsed, and when she found out Marina was pregnant, something inside her completely broke. Vanessa wasn't asking for forgiveness, she made clear to Julia. She knew she didn't deserve it. She just wanted Marina to know that she understood the gravity of what she did, and that she would carry that guilt for the rest of her life. Julia had listened to everything in silence, offering neither comfort nor condemnation, simply witnessing the confession of this broken woman. Marina listened to the whole story without interrupting. When Julia finished, she was silent for several minutes, processing. Finally, she said something that surprised even herself. She said she felt sorry for Vanessa. She didn't forgive what she did, probably never would, but she understood that Vanessa was also a victim of Philip's manipulations. Julia agreed. Philip had painted Marina as the villain to Vanessa, just as he probably painted Vanessa as crazy to Marina. He manipulated both women, pitting them against each other while he sat on the fence, enjoying the attention of two people who loved him. This realization was liberating for Marina. She realized that Vanessa wasn't really her enemy. The enemy was Philip's weakness of character, his inability to be honest and take responsibility. Both Marina and Vanessa had been deceived by the same man. The difference was that Vanessa reacted with violence while Marina chose dignity. Marina told Julia that she wanted no contact with Vanessa, but that if the woman was truly sorry, she should focus on rebuilding her own life after serving her sentence. Carrying guilt forever wouldn't help anyone. The important thing was to learn and grow from mistakes. That conversation marked another evolution in Marina's healing process. She was learning that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or accepting what happened, but rather freeing herself from the weight of anger, choosing not to let the actions of others continue to control her emotions. Philip's response to the lawyer's petition arrived 2 weeks later. He accepted all the conditions set by Marina without contest. He attached proof that he had already been in therapy for 6 weeks and formally declared that he no longer had any contact with Vanessa Price. He also included a personal letter to Marina, which the lawyers passed on. Marina held the envelope for a long time before opening it. Part of her didn't want to read it, didn't want to give Philip the opportunity to mess with her emotions again. But another part needed to know what he had to say, needed that closure. The letter was handwritten, in a hesitant script that showed nervousness. Philip began by apologizing more elaborately than in the television interview. He admitted he had been cowardly, selfish, and manipulative. He acknowledged that he had hurt Marina in unforgivable ways, and that he didn't expect forgiveness, only the opportunity to try to be a decent father to the child he didn't deserve. Philip wrote about how therapy was helping him understand destructive behavior patterns he had developed since adolescence. He had always been afraid of not being good enough, of disappointing expectations, and ended up creating different masks for different people. With Vanessa, he could be the non-committal rebel. With Marina, he tried to be the perfect man her family expected, but in the process, he lost touch with who he really was. The letter continued for several pages, with Philip describing the work he was doing to become a better person. He had distanced himself from friends who encouraged self-destructive behaviors, was focusing on personal development, and had even started volunteering with at-risk youth, trying to be the kind of role model he never had himself. Marina finished reading the letter with mixed feelings. Part of her appreciated Philip's honesty and apparent growth. Another part remained skeptical, remembering that words are easy, actions are what really matter. She put the letter in a drawer, deciding that only time would tell if Philip was genuinely changing or just saying what she wanted to hear. The months continued to pass. Marina's belly grew steadily, and she was now in her 7th month of pregnancy. The ultrasound had revealed she was expecting a boy, news that filled the Hayes' home with renewed joy. Helen had already decorated the nursery in shades of blue and grey, with nautical themes that reflected the family's love for the water. Marina spent hours imagining what her son would be like. Would he inherit her green eyes or Philip's brown ones? Would he have the calm temperament of the Hayes family or be more energetic? Would he be a musician, an engineer, an artist? The possibilities were endless and exciting. Beatrice Sterling had called a few more times during those months, always respectful and kind. Marina had agreed to meet her in person on one occasion, a quick coffee at a quiet bakery. Beatrice brought gifts for the baby, delicate clothes and a photo album of Philip's childhood, saying that, even if Marina didn't want to see it, maybe one day the boy would like to know a little about his father. That gesture touched Marina. Beatrice wasn't trying to justify Philip or ask for special treatment. She was simply being a loving grandmother, offering what she could without demanding anything in return. Marina thanked her and said that Beatrice would be welcome to meet her grandson after the birth, establishing that the visits would be coordinated and always with Marina or Helen present. The 8th month of pregnancy brought increasing physical discomforts. Marina felt the weight of her belly. With every movement, had trouble sleeping and her feet were constantly swollen. But every discomfort was accompanied by joy when she felt the baby move, when she saw his little feet pressing against her belly, when she heard his rapid heartbeat on the monitors at her appointments. Dr. Reed continued to monitor the pregnancy closely and was pleased with the health of both Marina and the baby. All the physical trauma from the wedding incident had been overcome, and emotionally, Marina showed impressive resilience. The doctor commented several times on how proud she was of the transformation she had witnessed in this young woman. Robert had become even more protective as the birth approached. He personally checked all the security at the house, made sure Marina had everything she needed before she even asked, and already had a medical team on standby for when labor began. Helen joked that her husband was more nervous than a first-time mother. One night, 3 weeks before the due date, Marina had a vivid dream. She dreamed she was back in the wedding ballroom, but this time everything was different. There were no guests, no flowers, no veil. It was just her alone at the altar, holding not a bouquet but her baby in her arms. She looked at the child and felt a deep peace, a certainty that everything had happened exactly as it was supposed to. In the dream, she walked out of the ballroom with confidence, leaving behind the rubble of what could have been. Outside, the sun was shining brightly, and an illuminated path stretched out before her. She began to walk, the baby safe in her arms, and she knew without a shadow of a doubt that the future would be good. Marina woke from that dream feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, pure and simple hope. Not hope conditioned on the behavior of others or external circumstances, but hope based on her own strength, on her ability to create a good life for herself and her son. She got out of bed and walked to the window, watching the sunrise paint the New York sky in shades of pink and orange. The city was slowly waking up, and Marina felt a part of that rebirth. She had weathered the storm and emerged stronger on the other side. She placed her hands on her belly, feeling. The baby moved gently. She whispered a renewed promise. She promised to give him a life full of love, truth, and courage. She promised to teach him about respect, about dignity, about the importance of treating people with kindness. She promised he would grow up seeing a strong mother who rebuilt her life after a disaster, and learned that being vulnerable doesn't mean being weak. Marina Hayes had started that year expecting a perfect wedding and a fairy tale life. Instead, she received trauma, betrayal, and public pain. But through that suffering, she discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. She discovered she was capable of forgiving without forgetting, of being generous without being naive, of loving without losing herself. The baby would be born soon, and with him would come a new phase of Marina's life, a phase where she would not be defined by who hurt her, but by who she chose to become in spite of it all. A phase where she would be a mother, a businesswoman, a daughter, a friend, but above all, she would be herself, complete and authentic. The sunlight completely filled the room, and Marina smiled at the new day. There were still challenges ahead. Philip would have to prove he deserved to be a part of his son's life. Vanessa would eventually be released from custody and would have to rebuild her own existence. New York society would still whisper about the wedding scandal for some time. But Marina was ready to face it all, no longer as the naive bride who walked down the aisle of the plaza, but as the strong woman who rose from the ashes of that tragedy, a woman who learned that a true happy ending doesn't come from a perfect wedding or a Prince Charming, but from the ability to pick yourself up and build something beautiful from the broken pieces. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the fresh morning air. She felt alive, whole, ready. The future awaited her, full of infinite possibilities. And for the first time since that fateful night, Marina Hayes was genuinely excited to find out what came next. The early hours of a Tuesday morning in May began with the first contractions. Marina woke up at 3 a.m., feeling a pain different from the other times the baby had moved restlessly. It was a tightening sensation that started in her back and radiated forward, making her entire belly harden for a few seconds before relaxing again. She lay there for a few minutes, mentally timing the intervals, as she had learned in her childbirth classes. When she realized the contractions were coming regularly every 10 minutes, Marina knew it was time. Her son was ready to meet the world. With a surprising calm for a first-time mother, Marina turned on the lamp and walked to her parents' room. She knocked gently on the door and called for Helen. Her mother woke instantly, years of a parent's light sleep making her react to the slightest sign of need. Seeing Marina standing in the doorway, hand on her belly with a serene but focused expression, Helen knew immediately what was happening. Within 15 minutes, the entire house was awake and moving in coordinated action. Robert made the necessary calls to the hospital and the driver. Helen helped Marina change clothes and grabbed the hospital bag that had been packed for weeks. The team of nurses Robert had hired quickly checked Marina's vital signs, confirming that labor was in its early stages but progressing well. The drive to New York Presbyterian was smooth at that early hour, with the city streets practically empty. Marina sat in the back seat next to Helen, breathing deeply through the contractions and chatting normally between them. She had decided to have a natural birth against Robert's initial suggestions for the scheduled safety of a C-section, but Marina wanted to experience the moment fully, to feel her body do the work it was designed for. At the maternity ward entrance, Dr. Carla Reed was already waiting, accompanied by a full team of obstetricians, nurses, and a neonatologist on standby. They had prepared meticulously for this birth, knowing Marina's traumatic history and wanting to ensure that this time everything would be perfect. Marina was taken to a spacious and comfortable birthing suite with soft lighting and relaxing ambient music. Helen stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and offering words of encouragement. Robert was in the waiting room, too nervous to be in the room, but close enough to be called at any moment. The next few hours were a roller coaster of sensations. The contractions gradually intensified, transforming from manageable discomfort into waves of pain that demanded all of Marina's concentration. Dr. Reed guided her through each phase, explaining what was happening, assuring her that everything was progressing normally. During a particularly intense contraction, Marina squeezed her mother's hand so hard that Helen had to restrain herself from showing pain. Between breaths, Marina looked at her mother and said something that made Helen cry. She said she finally understood the unconditional love a mother feels, that even before seeing her son's face, she knew she would give her life for him without hesitation. Helen kissed her daughter's sweaty forehead and said she was proud of the incredible woman Marina had become. Be it watching. Her transformation over the past few months had been one of the greatest joys of her life, that the baby would be blessed to have such a strong and dedicated mother. At 8 in the morning, after 5 hours of labor, Dr. Reed announced it was time to start pushing. Marina was exhausted but determined. Each contraction now came with an immense effort, her entire body working in sync to bring her son into the world. Helen counted the seconds of each push, encouraging Marina to keep going even when she said she had no strength left. Dr. Reed maintained, a calm and authoritative voice, guiding Marina through the process with the experience of someone who had assisted in hundreds of births. And then, at 8:43 a.m. on a sunny Tuesday in May, Miguel Hayes was born. The first sound he made was a strong, healthy cry that filled the room and made Marina burst into tears of relief and joy. Dr. Reed immediately placed the baby on Marina's chest, that small, wet body snuggling against his mother as he continued to cry. Marina looked at her son's face for the first time and felt the entire world realign around that moment. Miguel had dark, damp hair, eyes squeezed shut against the new light, a little mouth open in protest against the abrupt change of environment, his tiny fingers clenched and unclenched, searching for something to hold. "It's you," Marina whispered, touching her son's face with infinite gentleness. "You're my son. I'm finally meeting you." Helen watched the scene with tears streaming freely down her face. She had waited for this moment for so long, had feared that the traumatic circumstances of the pregnancy might affect the birth experience. But there was her daughter, radiant with love, holding her grandson, as if he were the most precious thing in the universe, and he truly was. After the initial procedures, after Miguel was cleaned, weighed, and examined, after they confirmed he was perfectly healthy at 7 pounds, 8 ounces, and 20 inches long, Robert finally entered the room. He had waited outside throughout the entire labor, pacing nervously, silently praying for everything to go well. When he saw Marina in the bed, pale but smiling, holding a little blue bundle, Robert felt something break inside him. He had contained his emotions for so long, being the strong rock on which Marina and Helen leaned. But in that moment, seeing his daughter become a mother, seeing his grandson for the first time, he couldn't hold back. Robert approached the bed with hesitant steps, as if on sacred ground. Marina looked up at her father, her eyes shining with pure happiness. She said she wanted him to meet Miguel, his first grandchild. Robert extended his trembling arms, and Marina gently transferred the baby into his grandfather's arms. The moment Robert held Miguel for the first time was profoundly transformative. This man who had built a business empire, who had faced countless challenges and never shown weakness, wept openly as he held that tiny life. He looked at his grandson's little face and saw a future full of possibilities, a new generation of the Hayes family, a renewed reason to keep building and protecting. Robert whispered promises to Miguel. He promised to be the best grandfather possible, to teach the boy everything he knew about business and life. He promised to protect this child with the same ferocity with which he had always protected Marina. And he promised that Miguel would grow up knowing he was loved unconditionally, no matter what choices he made or what paths he followed. The first hours after the birth were filled with carefully controlled visits. Julia arrived early in the morning, bringing a huge bouquet of flowers and a blue teddy bear. She cried when she saw her friend with the baby, remembering all the conversations they had during the pregnancy, all the shared fears and hopes. Julia held Miguel with reverent care and joked that she would be the most present and protective aunt any child ever had. In the afternoon, Beatrice Sterling arrived discreetly, bringing only a simple gift, a children's book that had belonged to Philip when he was a child. Marina received the visit with kindness, allowing Beatrice to hold her grandson for a few minutes. The older woman looked at Miguel with tear-filled eyes, seeing traces of her son, but also recognizing Marina's features. Beatrice thanked Marina for allowing this moment, for being generous enough not to punish a grandmother for the father's mistakes. Marina replied that every child deserved to have as much love as possible around them, and if Beatrice wanted to be a part of Miguel's life in a healthy way, she would be welcome within the established limits. Philip did not show up at the hospital that first day. Marina had made it clear through the lawyers that he could visit after a week, once she and Miguel were settled at home. She wanted those first few days to connect with her son without additional emotional complications. In the days following her discharge from the hospital, Marina settled into the exhausting but rewarding routine of motherhood. Miguel woke up every 3 hours to feed, and Marina discovered that sleep deprivation was real but bearable when she looked at that perfect little face. Helen helped whenever possible, but respected the moments when Marina wanted to care for her son alone. Robert transformed into the most devoted grandfather imaginable. He would come home from work and go straight to the nursery, pick up Miguel, and stay there for hours, talking to the baby about the company, about New York City, about plans for the future. Helen joked that Robert was raising a businessman before the boy could even talk. A week after the birth, the day of Philip's first visit arrived. Marina had conflicting feelings about the meeting. Part of her still felt anger and resentment. Another part recognized that Philip had met all the established conditions, continued with therapy, and had shown a genuine commitment to changing. Philip arrived at the agreed-upon time, bringing only a simple gift, a blank photo album for Marina to fill with moments of Miguel. He was visibly nervous, his hands shaking as Robert greeted him at the door with a neutral but not hostile expression. Helen escorted Philip to the living room, where Marina was waiting with Miguel in her arms. The moment Philip saw his son for the first time was charged with emotion. His legs nearly gave out, and he had to steady himself against the wall. Tears streamed down his face as he looked at the tiny baby who carried half his genes but represented so much more than biology. He represented a chance at redemption. Marina watched Philip's reaction carefully. She saw genuine surprise in his eyes, saw love being born, saw the reality of what he had almost lost through his selfish choices. She stood up with Miguel in her arms and walked toward Philip, stopping at a safe distance. "His name is Miguel," she said in a firm but not hostile voice. "Miguel Hayes." Philip noted that she hadn't given their son the Sterling surname. He didn't complain. He understood he had no right to complain about anything. He asked for permission to hold the baby, and Marina, after a brief hesitation, placed Miguel in his biological father's arms for the first time. Philip held his son with extreme care, as if holding fragile crystal. He looked at that little face and whispered apologies. He apologized for not being the father Miguel deserved from the start, for his character flaws, for letting fear and selfishness guide his actions. He promised he would be better, that he would learn, that he would do everything to earn a place in this boy's life. Marina watched the scene with Robert and Helen in the background, ready to intervene if necessary. But what she saw was a man genuinely transformed by fatherhood, someone who finally seemed to understand the magnitude of what he had almost destroyed. She didn't fully trust Philip yet. Trust would need to be rebuilt through consistent actions over the years, but she was willing to give him the chance to try. After 30 minutes, Marina said it was time for Philip to go. He understood without protest, reluctantly, returned Miguel to his mother's arms, and said goodbye. Before leaving, he turned to Marina and said with a choked voice that she was a much better woman than he ever deserved, and that Miguel was lucky to have such an extraordinary mother. Marina didn't respond. She just nodded slightly, accepting the acknowledgement but offering no emotional comfort. Philip left, escorted by Robert, and Marina sat back down on the sofa with Miguel, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. Relief because the first meeting had passed without drama. Sadness for the life that could have been if Philip had been the man he pretended to be. The following months brought a new routine for the Hayes family. Marina immersed herself completely in motherhood, discovering joys and challenges she never imagined. The sleepless nights, the inconsolable crying when Miguel had colic, the first giggles, the first smile. Each developmental milestone was experienced with deep emotional intensity. Philip visited Miguel once a week, always supervised and always respecting the boundaries Marina had set. He brought small gifts, talked to his son even knowing the baby didn't understand, and documented every moment with photos he treasured. Marina saw genuine progress in Philip, saw a man trying hard to be better, but she kept her guard up. When Miguel turned 3 months old, Marina returned to work at the development firm part-time. Robert had created a special position for her, leading a new department focused on sustainability and innovation. Marina discovered she loved the work, that using her mind to solve complex problems energized her in ways that were different from, but just as important as motherhood. She had hired a qualified nanny to help during her work hours, but Helen was also always available, loving having her grandson around. The routine was challenging. Balancing work and motherhood required meticulous organization, but Marina found she was capable of doing both excellently with the right support. Julia remained a constant presence, now promoted to Miguel's honorary aunt. She visited several times a week, helped with the baby when Marina needed a break, and had become an essential part of the support system that allowed Marina to thrive as a mother and a professional. A year after Miguel's birth, Marina was in her office at the firm reviewing projects when she received an unexpected call. It was Vanessa Price. Marina froze for a moment, never expecting to hear from that woman again. Vanessa quickly explained that she had gotten the number through a mutual acquaintance and was only asking for 5 minutes of conversation. Marina almost hung up, but curiosity made her keep listening. Vanessa said she had completed her sentence with community service and was rebuilding her life in another city. She was calling not to ask for forgiveness, she knew she didn't deserve it, but to thank her. To thank her because Marina could have pushed for a much harsher punishment, but chose moderation. Vanessa said that clemency had given her the opportunity to start over, and she was taking it. Marina listened without interrupting. When Vanessa finished, there was a long silence. Finally, Marina said she hoped Vanessa would use this second chance wisely, that she would find peace and purpose far from the people who had manipulated her. Vanessa thanked her with a choked voice and hung up. Marina never heard from her again. That call brought an unexpected closure for Marina. She realized she had truly forgiven Vanessa, not in a way that forgot the trauma, but in a way that no longer carried anger. Vanessa was a broken person who made a terrible mistake, paid for it, and was now trying to live a better life. Marina could respect that even without wanting contact. On Miguel's first birthday, the family organized an intimate party in the mansion's garden. Only close family and dearest friends were invited. Miguel was adorable in a navy blue outfit, crawling across the lawn chasing balloons that floated near the ground. His infectious laughter filled the garden with joy. Philip was present, keeping a respectful distance but clearly emotional seeing his son turn one. He had brought a special gift, a savings account in Miguel's name with a generous deposit. Marina accepted with a nod, acknowledging the gesture. During the party, Marina had a moment alone with Julia, watching Miguel play under Robert's watchful eye. Julia asked how Marina was feeling a year after the birth, a year and a half after the wedding disaster. Marina thought carefully before answering. She said she was at peace. It wasn't the life she had planned, not the fairy tale she had dreamed of as a teenager. But it was a good life, built on solid foundations of self-love, family, and purpose. Miguel was healthy and happy. She was thriving professionally. Her relationships with her family were stronger than ever, and she had discovered an inner strength she never knew she possessed. Julia hugged her friend, saying she was proud to have witnessed that journey. Marina returned the hug and said she couldn't have done it without the unconditional support of people like Julia, her parents, and everyone who surrounded her with love when she needed it most. That night, After all the guests had left and Miguel was asleep in his crib, Marina stood on her balcony watching the city lights. Robert joined her, bringing 2 cups of tea. Father and daughter stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Robert spoke. He said that watching Marina overcome everything she had been through was one of the most difficult but also most inspiring experiences of his life, that she had become a woman of exceptional character, a wonderful mother, and a brilliant professional, that he was more proud of her than words could express. Marina rested her head on her father's shoulder, feeling the familiar comfort of that embrace that always made her feel safe. She thanked him for everything he and Helen had done, for never letting her fall, for believing in her even when she doubted herself. Robert then asked something he had been holding back for months. He asked if Marina thought she could ever trust someone again for a romantic relationship, or if the trauma with Philip had permanently closed her heart. Marina considered the question honestly. She said she didn't know. For now, she was focused on Miguel and her career, and that was enough. But she didn't rule out the possibility of one day finding someone who deserved her trust, someone who understood that she came as a package deal with a son and a complicated history, someone strong enough to stand beside her as a true partner, not as a protector or a savior. If it happens, it will happen naturally, she said. But if it doesn't, that's okay too. I've learned that I can be whole on my own. Robert kissed the top of his daughter's head, satisfied with her answer. She had truly matured in ways he never imagined possible. The girl who walked down the aisle of the plaza had died on that traumatic day, but in her place, an extraordinary woman was born. The following years brought continued growth. For Marina, Miguel grew up strong and healthy, a cheerful and curious child who charmed everyone around him. Philip remained present, but in a limited role, accepting that he would never be the primary parent, but could be a consistent figure in his son's life. Beatrice became a loving grandmother, who visited regularly and had an excellent relationship with Marina. At the development firm, Marina prospered professionally. Her sustainability projects had put Hayes Development in the national spotlight, winning awards and recognition. Robert began preparing Marina to eventually take over as CEO of the company, confident that she had all the necessary qualities to lead. 3 years after Miguel's birth, Marina was at a real estate development conference in Chicago when she met Daniel Foster, an architect specializing in sustainable design. They were introduced during a panel on innovation and spent hours talking about projects, ideas, and visions for the future of construction. Daniel was 35, divorced with no children, and owned an architectural firm focused on ecological projects. He was different from Philip in almost every way, transparent in his communication, self-assured without being arrogant, respectful, and genuinely interested in what Marina had to say. They began communicating professionally, collaborating on a few projects. The friendship evolved naturally over several months. Daniel met Miguel at a corporate event where Marina had to bring her son. The way Daniel interacted with the boy, treating him with genuine respect without trying to force a connection, impressed Marina. When Daniel finally asked to take her to dinner, not as colleagues but as something potentially more, Marina hesitated. She talked at length with Helen and Julia, processing her fears. Both encouraged her to give it a chance, reminding her that not all men were like Philip. The first date was at a discreet restaurant in the West Village, with a view of the Hudson. They talked for hours about everything from work to life philosophy. Daniel was completely honest about his divorce, taking responsibility for his part in the relationship's failure. Marina, in turn, told her story with Philip, without minimizing or dramatizing, just stating the facts. Daniel listened to everything without judgment. In the end, he said he admired Marina's strength, but didn't see her history as negative baggage. He saw it as evidence of resilience, of character, of the ability to grow through adversity. He said that if Marina decided to give this potential relationship a chance, he would treat her with the respect and honesty she had always deserved. Marina didn't answer immediately. She asked for time to think, and Daniel accepted without pressure. In the following weeks, Marina talked with Dr. Cole in her therapy sessions, now monthly and focused more on growth than trauma. She talked to Miguel in language a 3-year-old could understand, about the possibility of Mommy having a special friend. Miguel, with the simplicity of children, asked if the special friend would be nice to him. Marina assured him she would only allow someone into their lives if that person was very nice to both of them. Miguel accepted this as perfect logic and went back to playing with his cars. Marina decided to give Danielle a chance. They started dating officially, establishing clear expectations and healthy boundaries from the beginning. Daniel respected that Miguel was Marina's absolute priority and never tried to compete for attention. He gradually integrated into their lives, earning Miguel's trust through consistent actions. Robert, initially skeptical of any man who approached Marina, did some discreet background checks on Daniel. He was impressed with what he found. A respected professional, financially stable, with no history of problematic behavior. Still, Robert made it clear to Daniel that any misstep would result in severe consequences. Helen, on the other hand, adored Daniel from the start. She saw how he looked at Marina with genuine respect and admiration. She saw how he treated Miguel with natural patience and affection. Most importantly, she saw how Marina blossomed beside him, becoming even more confident and happy. 2 years of dating passed. Daniel never pushed for a greater commitment, respecting that Marina needed time. When he finally proposed, it was in a simple and meaningful way, during a walk with Marina and Miguel on a quiet beach in the Hamptons at sunset. Marina looked at the man kneeling in the sand, holding a simple but beautiful ring, and felt absolute peace. There was no nervousness, no doubt, only the certainty that Daniel was a true partner, someone who loved both her and Miguel, someone who had proven through years of consistent actions that he deserved her trust. She said yes. Miguel jumped for joy, hugging them both and asking if Daniel would be his dad now too. Daniel gently explained that Philip would always be Miguel's biological father, but that he, Daniel, would be his stepfather and would love Miguel like a son if the boy would let him. The wedding took place a year later, in an intimate ceremony in the chapel of the Hayes' estate. Only 60 guests, people truly important in Marina and Daniel's lives. There was no ostentation, no hundreds of curious onlookers, just genuine love, sincere laughter, and vows that truly meant something. Marina walked down the small chapel aisle on Robert's arm, wearing a simple but elegant champagne-colored dress. Miguel, now 6, walked ahead as the ring-bearer, carrying the rings with adorable seriousness. There was no fear in Marina's heart, no shadows of the past threatening the present. When she reached the altar and looked at Daniel, waiting with eyes full of love, Marina knew she had finally found what she was looking for. Not a fairy tale Prince Charming, but a real partner, imperfect but dedicated, honest and true. They wrote their own vows. Marina promised to trust even when it was difficult, to always communicate with honesty, to consciously choose Daniel every day. Daniel promised to honor Marina as a complete and extraordinary woman, to never try to change her, to treat Miguel as his son in his heart, and to build a life based on mutual respect and true love. When they kissed as husband and wife, the guests applauded. Robert cried openly, seeing his daughter finally have the wedding she deserved. Helen held Miguel, whispering that his mommy was very happy. Julia filmed everything, ensuring every moment of that special day was preserved. Philip was present, sitting discreetly in the back pews. Marina had invited him as a gesture of maturity, recognizing that he was part of her story, and Miguel's father. Philip watched the entire ceremony with an expression somewhere between genuine happiness for Marina and sadness for what he himself had lost years ago due to his immaturity. The reception was in the mansion's garden, with delicious food and live music. Miguel danced with Marina, then with Daniel, then with his grandparents. Everyone celebrated not just the union of Marina and Daniel, but also the incredible journey Marina had undertaken. That night, as the party wound down and Miguel slept in Helen's arms, Marina and Daniel stood alone on the balcony watching the stars. Marina leaned against Daniel and whispered her thanks. "Thank you for waiting. Thank you for understanding. Thank you for being you." Daniel kissed the top of her head and replied that it had been worth every second of the wait. that Marina and Miguel were the greatest gifts life could have ever given him. In that moment, Marina thought about everything that had happened since that terrible day at the plaza. Vanessa's slap, Philip's inaction, her father's intervention, the birth of Miguel, the slow but steady rebuilding, the difficult choices, the personal growth, and finally the true love she found when she stopped looking and focused on becoming the best version of herself. Marina Hayes had started that journey as a naive bride expecting a fairy tale. She had fallen, broken, and many might have thought her story would end in tragedy. But she chose differently. She chose to rise. She chose to grow. She chose to build an extraordinary life from the broken pieces of what could have been. And there she was, years later, a complete and fulfilled woman, a dedicated mother, a respected professional, a beloved daughter, a loyal friend, a true wife, not because a man completed her, but because she completed herself first and then chose to share that completeness with someone worthy. The story that began with a crumbling altar ended with a new one, built on the solid foundations of self-love, personal growth, and conscious choices. Marina had learned that happy endings don't come ready-made as a prize for suffering. They come when you decide to build them yourself, brick by brick, choice by choice, day after day. And as the stars shone over New York City, Marina Hayes smiled at the future, knowing she was ready for whatever came next, because she had discovered the most important truth of all. The strongest woman she ever needed in her life had always been inside her, just waiting to be discovered.